Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. What I'm going to do is, in the next 35 to 40 minutes, is just think through some aspects of what an abolitionist approach might look like in Ireland, and how we might kind of move towards that. And I've kind of decided that I'm going to go a little bit out of my comfort zone for this talk, because I want to give Keith, as he's invited me over and paid for my hotel and my plane flight and everything, I want to give something which is a bit kind of original and hopefully something which is helpful to you in terms of moving forward. So if I do make some big faux pas in terms of Irish history or Irish context, please do just kind of let me know. But I'm doing it in a way which I'm hoping that this will be helpful for your kind of movement and going forward. But I'd like to start by just talking about penological amnesia and the development of an abolitionist imagination. Then I want to move on to talk a little bit about thinking beyond penal reform. I'll also mention some of the reasons why I became an abolitionist, because I think when people sometimes hear this notion of abolition, they kind of think, oh, well, let's just not bother with that. Let's just leave it. Let's just switch off. And actually, I think there's various different reasons why people, and various ethical and political aspects of why people become committed to the notion that we should end imprisonment, that we should stand against imprisonment, that we actually should look for radical alternatives. And I've noted already that there's been at least two of the kind of contributors in the previous sessions who've identified and requested this kind of sense that we need to actually step beyond the punitive rationale and to look for radical alternatives which actually do work. And so the second point will be thinking beyond penal reform. I'm also conscious that there are people here who work within the criminal process, and I don't want those people to feel as if this is just a talk to activists or just a talk to people who are developing kind of radical alternatives. I want also for those people in the room to feel part of this conversation. So I also want to talk about the importance of questioning penal legitimacy from within. The fact that voices and dissenting voices, subversive knowledges, can come from those both who are confined through penal confinement, but also those who actually hold the keys and those who administer it. And we'll talk a little bit in terms of historical context of some people who have raised those questions from within. I then want to kind of almost kind of bring it in this way a bit more kind of on tenuous kind of ground, because I'm not that au fait with Irish history or the politics, but I do want to kind of bring in some Irish voices. And I do want to kind of bring in some Irish dissenting voices in terms of people who have been imprisoned and who have been committed to kind of counter-colonial struggles in the Irish context, and their perspectives, and just three historical examples, because I want to kind of just bring in the fact that there are already dissenting Irish voices that have been made around the prison, and then think around moving towards an Irish penal abolition for our times, and how we can perhaps try and build something which can go beyond penal reform. And again, this is me as, I guess, someone coming in, not with a kind of preset plan, not with an agenda, but really someone who I'd like to help, and I'd like to kind of see if I can offer anything to you that might be of assistance in terms of an organic development within the Irish context. I'm not here to kind of tell you how to do it, but hopefully we can maybe together discuss and we can see how we can move forward collectively in terms of challenging some of the worst excesses of the kind of the penal rationale. Okay, so why would we have any interest in terms of reflecting upon a kind of abolitionist imagination? Why would we even want to contemplate taking such a bold step in terms of reflecting on penal reform? Well, partly it's because we do need to rethink things. And we do need to look at things very, very differently to what we have done in the past. What we seem to be almost kind of plagued by, and it's not just in Ireland, it's pretty much kind of across advanced capitalist societies and elsewhere around the world, that we seem to be stuck within a kind of notion of penological amnesia. And what I mean by that is we seem to kind of just forget the past. We seem to kind of look at ideas and say, right, brand new policy suggestion, let's do that. Without asking the question, has it worked before? Has it failed before? Is this simply an old idea that is being kind of repackaged and represented to us as a new idea? Is it what I would describe elsewhere as old vinegar in new bottles? Because prisons have a very strong aftertaste, and as we'll talk about in a moment, they've got a very damaging, in fact almost poisonous kind of element to them, and Shona has already touched on that with the kind of life expectancy of children in small burns research on that. But we can become trapped within the context of immediatism, and this is particularly significant in terms of policy suggestions and reform. And one way to disrupt prison policy is to take a historical lens, is to look at things in a longer trajectory, and to kind of, instead of saying what happened since 2010, in England and Wales, almost every debate is from 2010 onwards, because that's when the coalition government came into power, and Labour constantly say, since 2010, this has happened with the prison system. They don't look further back than that, because obviously that was a Labour government, and that say that's counterproductive. They don't look back to the previous century or the century before that. But that's exactly what we need to do if we want to understand why we are getting it so wrong with policies around responses to harms and wrongdoing. We get stuck into what I've described elsewhere as a penal merry-go-round. We go from one failed institutional idea to another failed institutional idea, to another, and we just keep on going round. And once we've exhausted all the other kind of ideas, we go back to the one that failed a few years ago and try it again. So we're simply on a merry-go-round of failure, followed by failure, followed by failure. And if we don't have a historical context, if we don't look at it over a longue durée, we don't realise that's what we're doing. So one element of an abolitionist imagination, and in fact one element of an imagination more broadly, is to be conscious of historical dimensions, is to be aware of the importance of history and historical continuities. Because when you look at the prison in a historical lens, abolitionism seems a perfectly natural and sensible position to take. And in fact, penal reform looks like a joke at times, because it's just like, how can you miss all these hundreds of years of failure? Because the prison as an institution, since it was first introduced in the early 1800s, as an institution, an institutionalized form of punishment, has been pretty much, albeit there's been changes in regimes, there's changes, lots of different kind of changes in terms of daily workings and so on and so forth. But as an institution, in principle, it's a reform prison. And we've had prison reform going back for over 200 years. And yet we've still got the same issues today that we had in the 1820s. So what does that tell us about the limits of penal reform? We also need subversive knowledge. And by subversive knowledge, what I mean is knowledge which is actually subverting the status quo. So subversive knowledge means to upturn, to upend, to have knowledge which can actually challenge the apple cart, upend the apple cart, not just kind of take a few apples off, a few bad apples off, and kind of put some new ones on. It's about kind of turning the cart over and saying, it's broken, it doesn't work, we need to try something completely different. We also need to situate it within socio-economic context. There's absolutely no way that we can understand the prison outside the context and the political economy of capitalism and the way in which neoliberalism shapes the way in which prison policies have evolved. We can't escape from the fact that prisons historically have been places for dealing with poor people, people from impoverished backgrounds, and we can't forget that prisons have very rarely dealt with the harms of the powerful and the harms of states and the harms of corporations. There's a very particular form of harm and a very particular form of group of people who are dealt with by the criminal law and end up in our prisons. And they are not necessarily the most dangerous and harmful people in our society. But they are often the most poorest and impoverished, who've grown up in care, who've kind of got substance use problems, who've had family issues, have probably been sexually abused, are unemployed, are homeless. These are the people in our prisons. These are the people we're talking about when we're referring to trauma. These are the people's parents when we're talking about the parents of children on the outside who are left behind. And it's the importance of hearing the voice of experience, but the voice of experience that contests power. And that's what abolitionists are interested in, is those voices, not just every voice, but voices that challenge power. Voices which have the courage to come out and say there's something wrong. Those have the courage to come out and actually reveal the harms that exist within the penal estate instead of concealing them. Those who have the courage to come and say we need to do something very different, despite the fact that we have this penological illiteracy, as Carlin put it many, many years ago. Carlin Tchaikovsky argued in 1996, this notion of we don't really read the prison particularly well. But also, we need to recognise that this imagination evolves organically. It isn't something you can import in. And we talked about a little bit some of the books which are the kind of people can peruse at their leisure, but one of them is the International Handbook of Penal Abolitionism, which I edited a few years ago, which looked at abolitionism all around the world. And the one clear thing from that was that when you looked at how abolitionist movement and abolitionist imaginations and ideas evolved in different countries, they were not imposed upon the kind of people. They came from the traditions and ideas and perspectives of the people within a given society or nation. They develop it organically. You can't just supplant them with something new and expect that to grow. It just fades away. It has to be something which comes from the people and reflect the views and sentiment and abolitionist sentiment that kind of exists. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So, thinking about kind of penal abolitionism, why would we want to kind of have an interest in penal abolitionist ideas? And I suppose all I can do is maybe give you a little bit of my own testimony, a little bit of my own kind of reasoning of why I became an abolitionist and why I became committed to abolitionism now for nearly 30 years. And it's actually, I'm going to go around the houses a little bit, so please just bear with me. I will get to the kind of cusp of the matter. But actually, I became an abolitionist in 1996. And there was a kind of number of factors that kind of led to that. I'd actually been involved in quite a lot of policing work before then, and I'd done some work on community policing in South West Lancashire. And I was about to embark on a big piece of research with Phil Scrapen, who was a professor of criminology at the time in Lancashire, on Southwest community policing. And unfortunately, just at that time, as the funding came through, my father became very, very seriously ill with leukemia. And I had to kind of go back to the northeast of England. My mother was also kind of quite ill, and I had to kind of do a bit of kind of caring work. And my father ended up going into Royal Victoria Infirmary. And he'd actually been poisoned in the workplace. And he used to work for Geest, which was a kind of fruit importer at the time. It was a big kind of banana kind of, you might know it from the kind of 80s and 90s, the Geest kind of adverts. And he was a lorry driver and a car mechanic. And in his garage, that actually stored some toxic waste, and the toxic waste had leaked, and everyone in the garage got a different form of leukemia, and they all died apart from my dad. And he actually ended up in the RVI at Newcastle, and while I was there, I got chatting to the Anglican chaplain at the kind of hospital, and we started to look into the possibility of me doing some research on prison chaplaincy. And the Anglican chaplain at the RVI gave me the telephone number of all the chaplains in the northeast of England. So there was no Home Office approval. There was no convention. This is 1996. So I wouldn't have got away with it now. I didn't go in by conventional means. So I phoned them all up, and as it turned out, all of them said yes. And I ended up spending 3 months doing research on prison chaplains in 6 prisons in the northeast of England, which was later to become a book called Heavenly Confinement. And when I was doing that kind of work, I guess I was like horrified by what I saw. And again, it's an experiential thing. When I was going round the prisons, I went round kind of all different kinds of prisons. So I went round the dispersal prison, which was H&P Frankland. I went round Durham prison, which at that time also had what was known as Shiehe wing, which was the high security wing for women prisoners. Went round Dearbold and Castington, which were Y&Is. I went round 2 other prisons as well, and one of which was a Category C training prison in Northumberland, next door to Castington, and the other was actually Askham Grange, which was down at the north end of York, and was an open prison for women. Now, the reason why this experience was so formative was I kind of got access to all areas, and I was still quite a young person, and I said I'd been kind of really interested in policing research, but I'd read a lot of abolitionist literature, but by that point I was not an abolitionist. I was actually more interested in corporate harm, and kind of recognising that kind of corporations can kind of create havoc and devastation for families and people by the negligence and the kind of way in which they deal with kind of failures in terms of health and safety. But going into the prison, I was kind of shocked and horrified by what I saw, and I was kind of taken as a trainee chaplain. So I was shadowing the chaplains, going around the prisons, including high security prisons, going around the wings, going around the punishment blocks, segregation. I was seeing everything completely unvarnished. And I was horrified. And I thought, this is not right. This is shocking. What I'm seeing is people who are young and vulnerable, and or people even kind of all ages, who are struggling incredibly in a context that was a form of, what I consider as a form of useless suffering. I couldn't see any benefit in this. I couldn't see any good that was coming from this. And because I'd seen so many different kinds of prisons, and because I've spent such a significant amount of time now, this is not the same as someone who works in the prison or somebody who's a prisoner. Those experiences are unique and they're different. Mine is as a prison researcher. But I was exposed, and it became quite formative. So whereas in 1995, I clearly wasn't a prison abolitionist, by the end of 1996, I almost kind of definitely was, and I've been so since then, because I could not see the rhyme or the reason or the logic. Prisons to me seem to be places of violence, suffering and death. I couldn't see or find a way of actually comprehending this. And when I spoke with the chaplains themselves, I got a very clear message from them that actually prisons were really, really problematic. So one chaplain called Steve Mann, and this is cited from Heavenly Confinement, when I asked him what prisons were for, he said this: God knows. I don't know. I haven't the faintest idea. It seems to me that prison is a total failure. Frankly, I think that prisons are keeping people out of sight and out of mind. Prisons are such a terrible waste. That's an example of subversive knowledge from within. That's an example of someone being courageous and being honest and saying that prisons are a complete and total abject failure. But we can actually look at this in terms of kind of what the government does tell us in terms of data and analysis. And of course we know from things around self-harm and self-inflicted deaths and other deaths in prison that prisons are incredibly damaging, poisonous and harmful institutions. So in 2023, according to Ministry of Justice data, there were 733 incidents of self-harm per 1,000 prisoners in England and Wales. 733 per 1,000. It's enormous. Between April 2022 and March 2023, there were 88 self-inflicted deaths in England and Wales. That's more than one a week. There were 305 deaths in total in prisons in England and Wales in 2003. And there's been somewhere in the region of 6,000 deaths in prisons since 2000 in England and Wales. But actually it goes further than that. The data is actually also indicating something else. And this is what Shona touched on a little bit with Smallbone's work, and the fact that life expectancy for children who have parents in prison drops. Well, there's also been research done on the life expectancy of people who are incarcerated. And there's been at least 4 studies I'm aware of that have been done on this since 2013, all longitudinal studies, and all of which have kind of been able to map out just how damaging prisons are to prisoners. And the basic conclusion is, although there's slight variances between them, the basic conclusion is that 1 year of prison served knocks 2 years off somebody's life. Now you put that in the context of poverty. You put that in the context of kind of the wider social kind of harms that exist in society. And you are talking about an institution that slowly kills people, it slowly kills prisoners. It also seems to slowly kill not just children, as Shona said, but also slowly kill prison staff. So one of the big kind of debates at the moment in England is about the retirement age of prison officers. And this is because for a number of years it's been known that prison officers have a life expectancy of 18 months post finishing the job. Prison officers don't get killed in work in England and Wales. There's a different context in the north of Ireland. There's been a number of prison officers killed, but in England and Wales, by the research I've been able to find, there's somewhere in the region of 9 prison officers have been murdered in the prison place since about 1870. And the last one was Derek Lambert in the 1960s. Prison officers do not face murder in prison, but they do die. They do die shortly after they finish their job. So what we're talking about is an institution which, as I say, from my own personal perspective, I thought this was a horrific sense of man's inhumanity against man and woman. And then the data is kind of all saying to us that these places kill and people die. Not much about rehabilitation, not much about deterrence, but really lots of evidence that prisons slowly kill us. And this is because of what I've described elsewhere as institutionally structured violence. That there's something structured within the way in which prison works, the very essence of confinement. And this is why we can take this longue durée, why we can go back, because the essence of confinement, which is about waste and loss and endings and estrangement, all the things actually that Anna and Shona were talking about in the kind of earlier sessions, they are key characteristics of what a prison is. It's about loss and taking things away. It's about damaging people. It's about not only not meeting need, which for people like Galton would be a form of violence, but also generating new needs that are never met because of the deprivations of penal confinement. So what we have is this toxicity. And I think that when we start talking about prison reform, in truth, we're talking about utopian thinking. And I mean that in the negative sense, that this is a nowhere place. Because there is no kind of scenario where we find this sense of a perfectly reformed prison on a large scale that has operated for a long period of time. We just don't find that. We find actually some reforms that work for a little bit, some reforms that work in some places but not others. We do find small elements of kind of change. But when you look at it over a 200-year period, the conclusion is absolutely kind of clear. Prisons are places of harm, suffering, violence and death. They always have been, and I'm afraid to say they always will be. And that's something we've got to live with if we're going to live with the prison, is that very sense and knowledge and understanding. And what we need to do ultimately is to try and move forward and try and develop some kind of progressive change that can kind of work within the society we live in right now, because I don't think abolitionists are utopian. I think abolitionists are actually profoundly realistic. They're profoundly realistic in the sense that this is talking about what a prison is and defining it for what it is, which is an abhorrent kind of institution which kind of damages people. But also they're realistic and pragmatic in terms of moving forward. You know, you don't necessarily hear a lot of kind of abolitionist kind of talk, which is about kind of building new kind of worlds without prisons. It's all about what we can do in the here and now to try and make things better and actually try and move forward in ways by exploiting contradictions. And one of those, as actually was indicated a little bit earlier, about what we can do in some of the questions, was about disseminating knowledge and generating new public understandings of what the prison is, sharing these facts, sharing this research, being aware that this kind of is, you know, for those who work within the prison system or work with people on release or so on and so forth, will know that with their own eyes. They'll know kind of just how difficult it is, how hard it is, and how kind of the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis in terms of their work, and how that is kind of really difficult when you constantly have to deal with people who are coming back in and they're not being solved, the problems that they're facing. That these are really, really difficult day-to-day basic challenges that actually can take us away from even any form of kind of wider thinking on this. But we need to have this kind of subversive knowledge out there. We need to have this knowledge that actually can challenge prisons. And I think we can get this from various different sources. We can get this from, for example, hearing the voice of prisoners. That is really, really important, that we do platform prisoner voices, and we hear and we learn about the voices, particularly of prisoners who have been prepared to contest power and have been prepared to resist. And if you are interested, there's a number of kind of chapters in the International Handbook of Penal Abolition, which we got prisoners to write to us who were abolitionists. And they kind of shared their testimonies about kind of what abolitionism meant to prisoners and how their voices kind of, you know, should be kind of absolutely central to the debate. And for any kind of movement moving forward in Ireland, then the voice of the prisoner is also going to be absolutely significant. But of course, those voices can be disqualified. They can be pushed to one side. So there's another form of kind of raising subversive knowledges that can come from prison staff and prison administrators. It can come from truth-telling. It can come from being courageous and being prepared to stand up there and say, this is what's really going on in terms of the prison place. And that's happened in the past. I won't go into too much detail, but you have all sorts of examples, certainly from people I'm aware of in England and Wales, of prison officers, prison chaplains, prison medical officers, prison administrators, prison governors, who have had the courage and have been prepared to stand up and say that actually this is shambolic and we actually need to do something which is really, really going to work here, and a few tweaks around the edges are not going to be sufficient. And a number of these cases are very, very well known. But just to take one example here would be Sir Alexander Patterson, who was Commissioner of Prisons of Convict Prisons in England and Wales, was famous for creating the Borstal prisons in 1908. Now, Patterson, when he came to the end of his career, he decided to kind of reflect back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, about what he'd kind of seen. And some of the language that he used include that for Patterson, prisons were ultimately a sentence of living death and a place which could so easily become an unhealthy little cesspool. This is from one of the leading penal reformers in England and Wales. And in fact, we should abandon the notion of prisons and instead adopt non-punitive and non-penal forms of confinement. He kind of didn't go as far as abolitionism in the broader sense, but he basically said that an institution grounded in punishment, which is what the prison is absolutely not going to work. And in fact, it becomes places of kind of unhealthiness, harm, and death. Exactly the kind of points which I was kind of making earlier. So you do have these different voices. You do have these different kind of numerous examples which can break through some sense of penological amnesia. They can be incredibly helpful because people listen to what people who have experience say. They listen to people. They won't necessarily listen to an academic or listen to a kind of an activist, but they will listen to someone who works in the prison or someone whose voice actually has come from the lived experience of prison itself. It carries so much more weight and so much more power because people know what they're saying is reflective of their lived experience. It's not just something they read in a book. It's not just something that told them. It's something that actually they've lived through. And that works in terms of shaping people's kind of approaches. So that's why I want to kind of lead us into just some examples of dissenting Irish voices. And again, excuse me for my limited historical and penological understanding of the Irish concept. As I say, this is just to kind of to help if it is helpful, and if not, you can just discard it. But I think that It's really important when moving forward in terms of challenging and disrupting prison policy in Ireland that actually this is something that evolves organically. So it's not about kind of picking up some American abolitionist books or British abolitionist books or from elsewhere. That can be really helpful and it can give you some idea of what the discourses are. But as I mentioned earlier, critiques of prison systems come from within, and they only really stick if they can connect with various different traditions and ideas and voices of people from that given nation, area, society, and so on and so forth. You just can't transfer or transplant it. So the first thing I would suggest in terms of moving forward, in terms of kind of abolitionism in Ireland, is to kind of look at what's already there and to try and connect with that, and to connect in terms of the kind of traditions, the ideas, the abolitionist voices that already exist, the philosophies, the theologies, the political activism, the colonial, counter-colonial struggles, and so on and so forth. To think back about a kind of indigenous kind of a sense of kind of Irish critique of the prison system. And of course, if you look at this in terms of a global context, you might be able to take inspiration from the indigenous abolitionisms of countries like Canada, or New Zealand, or United States, or Australia, where they, from a counter-colonial kind of perspective, have very much raised kind of particular voices from the indigenous populations, and have actually argued very strongly against prisons, based on those kind of traditions that existed in the kind of past. So that's one way of kind of thinking about it. But another way is also to hear the voices of various different prisoners. And again, the ones which I'm probably most familiar with are from historical examples. And I just want to kind of give you 2 or 3 kind of examples here before I move on to the final slide, because I think my time probably is coming towards a close. I think I've got 5 minutes left, so I'll just go through this reasonably quickly. But just from the kind of the voices of Irish prisoners, you can find sediments and kind of embryonic notions of abolitionism. Michael Davitt grew up in a place where I live. He was born in Mayo, but he grew up in Haslington in East Lancashire. And there's a kind of museums to Davitt there. In fact, there's a conference going on in a couple of months on Michael Davitt. And Davitt was obviously a very significant kind of Irish nationalist MP and also kind of a leading member of the Land League. He was also imprisoned in a number of prisons in England. And he was he was in prison on 2 different occasions. The first for selling kind of arms. He was done for treason felony, for buying arms for Fenian rebels. And then later he had his ticket of leave basically suspended because he was involved in radical politics and the Land League. And it was caused quite a controversy. But the psychological and physiological toll that the prison took on Davitt was palpable. When he first entered prison, he was measured at 6 foot tall. When he was released 7 years later, he was measured at 5 foot 10 and 1.5 inches. And this is a man who also as a boy had lost his arm in a kind of accident in Accrington Mill, in the cotton mill. But Davitt wrote extensively. He's one of the most kind of prominent writers on prisons in the late 19th century. He wrote a number of different volumes, but also gave evidence to the Gladstone Report of 1895, which is one of the most significant reports in English prison history. But for Davitt, prisons were places of grave evil. They were barbarous, inhumane, characterised by suffering and humiliation, vindictiveness and hardships that reduced prisoners to the level of untamed beasts. And Davitt kind of talked about things like selective abolitionisms. He wanted to see the end of child imprisonment. He wanted to see the end of some aspects of the kind of penal system in England at that time in terms of penal servitude and so on and so forth. But he was calling for radical change in prisons. Another example would be, say, someone like, say, Constance Markowitz, who herself was in prison following the Easter Rising of August 1916. On the 9th of June 1917, from Aylesbury prison, she wrote, "I think I'm coming to believe in anarchy. Laws work out as injustice, legalised by red tape. And then later, when she was in Holloway prison on the 11th of September 1918, she writes, "We were frightfully excited by the peelers' strike. Why don't the jailers do ditto and by way of sabotage destroy the jails?" So we have these kind of voices that are already kind of there, which kind of indicate that there is a kind of voice and there is a tradition within kind of Irish prison literature which suggests that there are these sediments and sentiments of people who would want to challenge. And of course you will probably know much more about these characters, others, and also the kind of traditions and so on and so forth. But just to come to a conclusion in the last couple of minutes, I think if we are looking towards an Irish penal abolitionism for our times, then we do need to kind of have a historical lens. We do need to try and avoid that penological amnesia. We do need to actually say that if we're going to talk about doing changes, we need to know if those changes have been tried in the past and if they've been successful or a failure. And I think actually we probably all might well know what the answer to that is, given the kind of abject failure of prisons for centuries. There needs to be, I think, a profound questioning of penal legitimacy. It's not just about overcrowding. It's not just about conditions. There's actually something fundamentally damaging, poisonous, harmful, that is the prison in terms of what it does to people, what it does to their family members, and what it does to the people who work within them. It slowly kills them. It slowly takes years off their lives. And that is something which we don't call murder. We might well think of it as social murder. And indeed, going back again to the 1840s, before Engels wrote about this, the Chartists of England were talking about prisons as places of legal murder and places of social murder or murderous social environments that kind of would lead us down the pathway to think that actually we don't call it a big social harm, but actually prisons are slowly doing incredible damage to people's well-being, health and longevity of life. We need to hear and we need to learn from the voices of people on the inside. We need to hear the voice of experience and those who are prepared to contest power. That's absolutely crucial, I think, in terms of raising the kind of awareness of where we can move forward. We also need to hear subversive knowledge. Now, for me, a lot of subversive knowledge is simply telling the truth. It's simply kind of stating what it is. It's subversive because it doesn't fit certain kind of official narratives. But for me, kind of describing and exploring the kind of the nature and reality of the prison is a form of subversive knowledge, but it's also a form of truth-telling. It's a form of bearing witness. And I think that's actually something which is really, really important when we think about how we move forward in terms of building that kind of popular support. But that popular support, I think, and that imagination should develop organically, and it should be something which reflects the kind of the views and opinions of the people of Ireland. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.